So to start off with, Paul, at various points in interviews, in writing about this film, you've made the comment that you expected it to piss people off from the very beginning. You went into it with the knowledge that it was a confrontational film or a film that sort of lays down a kind of gauntlet. Is there something about that sort of confrontation that excites you, that inspires you?
Well, I love the hot buttons. And I had a couple on this one. I had a May December. That's a hot button now. It didn't used to be. I had a kind of interracial, not quite the hot button it used to be. I had a kind of Dirty Harry-ish thing going on. But when we were raising the money, people sort of were saying about the May December thing, can't the girl be a little older? Does she have to be his own daughter's age? Which I kind of liked. And so I thought, well, I know how I'll get over this criticism. At that time, the character was a mafia hitman who was in witness protection. I said, I'll make him a Proud Boy or a white supremacist. That way people will be so worried about that, they won't worry about the May December. And then when we were casting, I said, now if you really want to fuck with the audience's head, let's cast Kevin Spacey. Because their heads will just be spinning because they don't know which direction to be most offended by.
And sending it right over to Joel and Sigourney. I'm curious, when you read the script and came on board to the project, was your impression that you were going to
be Kevin Spacey?
Ruffle some feathers, or
I'm sure he would have been available, by the way.
Was that exciting for you as a sort of an element of the project's appeal?
Ruffle feathers,
or just sort of to make a film that you knew perhaps was going to be divisive in ideological terms, or in...
Yeah, with the short space of time we have here, I do remember asking Paul early on, after initially reading the script, about the relationship with Maya. Was that there to be, I kind of knew what Paul's answer might be, but just to check. Was it there to kind of excite the audience, to be titillating, or was it there to sort of shake the tree a little bit and make people a little bit, challenged by it? And of course, his answer was the latter, and I was like, great. I don't want to be part of that sort of thing that I used to get confused about. I remember watching a Clint Eastwood movie years ago, and I came in really late into the film, and he's having a chat at the bar with this young girl, and I thought, oh, it's his daughter, and then he reached over and started making out with her, and I was like, what? She's like 23. So to know that it was there to be challenging, but at the same time allow the space to be, it's challenging, but it's also about love, and it's okay as well. And so I knew that that's what I was signing up for.
Sigourney, your character is quite villainous in some respects.
I don't think so.
There you go.
Yeah. Testing. Yes, I don't think she's villainous.
Perhaps that's a strong word, but did you...
You can easily think of her as the villain, but I think she begins this scenario with good intentions. Whether she's able to follow through with that once things happen is, of course, another story.
Did you see the character as, Paul, you've discussed the film as a fable, and there's a great deal of sort of symbolic weight to the characters and the story. And I'm curious, both to hear from you, Paul, but also from the performers, what goes into building a three-dimensional human character when the framework for the story is so heavily allegorical and heavily...
When I use the word fable, it's a kind of defense against people who say this could never happen. it probably can't, although there are a couple rare instances where white supremacists have done a 180 and taken up the other position. But mostly they don't. We are who we are. So the thinking behind this film wasn't, this is the way it is. It was instead, what if it could be this way? And that's also an incitement to the imagination, and it's also a thing that artists do. So it's not necessarily, this is the way it is.
I mean, I think Paul is such an amazing writer. The movie works on a lot of different levels, and the level that I, first communicated was the level of these three people who have in common Graceland, this garden. Maya loves it, and Norma remembers her being enchanted by it and enchanting. And what I think is a testament to the skill of our writer-director is that they do operate as, I think, believable human beings. I don't think we can worry about the fable part of it. You just, play it as honestly as you and fully as you can. And then it's up to the story and the audience to make whatever conclusions they want to.
I mean, look, personally, I think if you read any news article that starts with Florida man, ... you realize that this is far more plausible than a lot of other things you might learn about even in the news. And I think that, for me, it was more the question of how do you personally feel about, for example, that romance. For me, often, even during the shoot, is questioning or wondering, is Narvel as a character, as a person, deserving of redemption and therefore that union or not, and how does the audience feel about it? And also, I have this feeling like if the ending of this film were different, that he wasn't deserving of it, that it would maybe an easier to digest story, if that makes any sense.
I mean, there was a change in the ending of this film. It wasn't meant to be a trilogy, but when I had the idea and I was telling it to somebody, they said to me, "Oh, that's the third part of a trilogy," and I realized, in fact, they were right. But I had ended it in a very predictable, generic fashion with a bloodbath, just like Taxi Driver. And I started feeling, I'm getting a little old for this. And, what if I go the other way? What if no one is killed at the end, and he doesn't have to flee for his life, and he isn't on the run again, but in fact he has a home and he has a wife? And I thought, that's a better way to go at this point in my life. And as I said at the Venice Film Festival, I said when I was a young man, I used to say, I don't want to leave this world until I say, fuck you. Now I don't want to leave it until I say I love you, which is the lyric at the end.
And I think transformation is kind of at the heart of the film, which is to come back to your comment, Sigourney, about that Norma's not quite a villain. She's a flawed human, as is Norval, and perhaps the severity of their flaws is something that they, in different degrees, wrestle with. And by the end of the film, I think we have witnessed a kind of transformation take place, certainly in Norval, but even in Norma as well. I think her perspective has shifted. How did you, as performers and perhaps in collaboration with Paul, how did you chart out those transformations in the characters? Did it come out of the script, or was it more in the process of enacting?
Well, certainly it's one of the most precise and elegant scripts I've ever read. So I do feel the script really works on you, so that these things that might seem impossible on first reading become very logical. It's true that Norma changes, because I think Norma's never lost before. and she doesn't like it much. She makes the same mistake as King Lear. She gives away the kingdom. That never works out.
Oh, I mean, yeah, the script and conversations with Paul. I think one of the interesting things, for example, with this film, even though I do think, and Paul and I talked about this, there is a moment in the film that is a clue to the transformation or the shift from the stuff we see of Narvel in the past to what makes him the man that he is in the main body of the film, in the garden. Where does that real transformation happen of the shift of his opinion, his view on the world, and his actions? You know, a lot of that is, and I really appreciate Paul's ability to lay out story where he's not explaining everything to you, not everything is exposited there, and it's a sort of the rules of engagement of inviting the audience in to participate in making certain decisions. And so a lot of that stuff is the guide for me about everything is really about what's in the script, and then conversations with Paul if I feel like I want to make sure where those gaps translate for me in the playing.
And I know the sort of trilogy quality of this film, First Reformed and The Card Counter, seems to have emerged organically in the sort of conception of this film. And I'm wondering if that informed the work that you all did on set. Was there a process of referencing the earlier two films or earlier films in your career, Paul, or was it more of a focus on this film as a separate
It's
entity?
a kind of post-facto trilogy. It's like Bergman's famous trilogy, which was what you call the trilogy after the fact. But I do know that when I was writing it, you know, I said, well, I have this guy in his room, and he's writing his occupation. It's a nice, rich occupational metaphor. It's a duplicitous metaphor because the garden can represent evil and it cannot represent good, and violence and passivity. And so when I have this guy, and I have the journal, I have the occupational metaphor, and then this is when I really knew it was going to be a trilogy. I said, in First Reformed, I was trying to explain how this man who was so desperate to speak to God and who God wouldn't do, I felt he was just so close. He could reach out and touch God, but he couldn't actually do it. I said, how can I show that in fact these people are so close to the spiritual realm and they can't touch it? And I said, I'll have them levitate. And so I had that sequence where they levitate. And then in the next one, Card Counter, I said, you know, how can I get these people out of this realm? And I have this Christmas display which becomes a Christmas fantasia. So this one I said, you know, okay. Well, here I'm talking about a garden, and they finally break through. I have, the reverse plantation sex scene, and the world comes alive. All of a sudden it just blooms. And so that's when I knew it was a trilogy, is when I realized I was hitting a certain same markers. And therefore, the ending would really matter because the ending would get rack up to the other two. But I'm done now. Critics like trilogies. They don't like tetralogies. And this is not going to be a tetralogy.
In the process of building the characters, once again, Joel Narvel is very much in conversation with the protagonists of these other two films, and yet very vividly a distinct person, a distinct character. Did you, was that conscious again, or was that more just a focus on the character and the scenario at hand, and it's sort of the variations across these three characters and the dialogue between them emerged out of that?
My relationship with the other two films of the trilogy really is just really about my appreciation for them. In particular, before I had a conversation with Paul about this, I hadn't seen the card counter, but I went and saw First Reformed at the Angelica on the first couple of days that it opened. I can't remember exactly the order, but seeing a trailer and getting excited about Paul having a new film out and knowing a bit about it, I was very eager to see it, and I was more than impressed by what I saw. So I wasn't really thinking about any other connection or relationship with that film or the card counter while we were in the midst of making this. But I do think that my conversation with Paul, and I know it was a bit of maybe a playbook for actors that take the centerpiece of his films, which is about essentially doing nothing. No, you leave your bag of acting tricks behind and allow yourself, maybe Paul can speak more to this, but...
Yeah, well, I mean, this was the two sort of times it came up. I was talking to Joel about Card Counter, and he had just seen it, and he said, talking about Oscar Isaac's performance, and he said, boy, he's pretty good when he doesn't do anything. And then we were talking about his hair, and I sent him a picture of Ethan Hawke in First Reformed, and I said, this is his hair. So those are the only two references I had made with him.
Whether in the writing process or again the pre-production, did you research the psychology of a reformed Proud Boy or of somebody who'd gone through an arc like that, or even just sort of a textural research into what the life of an extremist of that?
Well, it's very easy to do today. You know, in the past, you want to research, I mean, you had to often go to a different city, you had to go to the archives, you had to find people. Today, it's all there at the press of a keystroke. And so you can watch documentaries about these guys and their paramilitary and their ideologies. And so research is, in fact, much easier than it used to be. And but the temptation of research is still the same, which is at some point you have to stop, because you can research an idea to death and then you never write it.
In terms of the sort of historical undercurrents of this film, both in the sense of the land that Greenwood Gardens is on, which is suggested to be a plantation. It's never explicitly spelled out as the history of this space, but it's been in Norma's family for a long time, and there's clearly a sort of a positioning that's being done to this setting, and that's in relation to a history that ultimately leads to the Proud Boys, or is in a continuum.
I mean, that's something that's been picked up on. It was not intended. Manola picked up on it in today's time. Originally, I wanted to shoot this film in Melbourne because we were going to shoot it in our winter, their summer. And Melbourne's a great garden city. And that's how Joel ended up getting cast, because we had Australian money and names started coming up. And Joel's name came up because he lived in Sydney. And then COVID hit Melbourne for 14 months. And all of a sudden we had to find someplace else to shoot. And we ended up in Louisiana. And but the Australian money stayed with us, and I liked Joel, and so I stayed with Joel. But so it didn't really begin as a Southern thing. But now you're in Louisiana, and you're talking about a big, great, private, personal garden. Well, they're all ex-plantations, as was this one. Same plantation, Emancipation, was shot at it. And but I really said, let's not make a point of it. Let's try to stay from as much plantation imagery as we can. There are certain angles and certain things you can show that just sing plantation. And if it's there, the viewer will find it. Just like in Taxi Driver, Vietnam is never mentioned. You know that he's a vet. You know that he's troubled, but Vietnam is never mentioned. The reviewers all said that he's a Vietnam vet. Well, the text doesn't say that. And the text doesn't say that this place is a plantation. but Manola's review this morning was referring to the history of the plantation. So I think that's a marker of smart storytelling, when you get the reader or the listener to provide the little piece that's missing to the puzzle.
I'm going to open it up in just a moment, but I have to ask, Paul, do you keep a journal, or do you relate to this impulse to document your
No, I wish. I'm very jealous of people who do. I've never kept a journal, never been a taxi driver, never been a drug dealer, never been a gigolo, never been a minister, never been a poker player, never been a gardener. But I do envy people who keep journals.
And there's something compelling in the drama of that. Makes sense to me. We can open it up now. We have some microphones that'll come around. So if you raise your hand, I'll call on you. And then I see a hand right here in the front. And here's a mic coming.
First of all, thank you all for being here. I really liked the film. To me, it seemed, I kind of liked how it showed how all of those characters were flawed, and they had like a lot of baggage to carry. And at least with Joel's character and the girl, like it showed that sometimes you just gotta be patient and wait for the right opportunities to come up. I kind of saw it like that. And my question for all of you is, since you shot the film in New Orleans, basically, what was some of the stuff that you really wanted to capture of the city, or you basically were like, you know what, let's just use whatever we have to our advantage. It doesn't matter where we shot it.
Were you able to follow that?
I'm sorry. My question was that since you shot the film in New Orleans, you basically said that it was originally planned to be shot in Australia, and then you said that you just wanted to shoot it in Louisiana because you had the opportunity to do it there. But did that choice of basically saying that you didn't want it to show that it was on a plantation, did that come afterwards, or? Yeah, that's my question, basically.
So was it a conscious choice to sort of leave the sort of site-specific
Yeah, it's very
detail?
conscious. In my mind, it took place somewhere, Virginia, North Carolina. Although, of course, once you have the architecture of the plantation house, it's kind of locked in. But I wanted to let that go aside. The reason it had to be Louisiana was because of Joel's schedule. We had to get him off the show so he could get a big payday with a Netflix show. And so we ended up shooting in March when I wanted to shoot in April. So the weather really wasn't where we had to be. We had to be as far south as possible. And we still had frost a couple nights. And then the co-star of Joel's Netflix show was Will Smith. Well, that show didn't happen. So we could have shot in April.
It's all connected, I think.
I'm learning as much as you guys are learning here.
I see another hand right here. There's a mic just coming.
Hey guys, thank you for coming today. Sigourney, you're the best. Joel, you're amazing. I think you'd be a great Wolverine. But my question is for Paul. In all three films of this trilogy, you made it, it's usually a younger person who saves the main character from his previous purgatory. Did you make this as a conscious choice in your writing, in the sense that the youth can perhaps heal the mistakes of the older generation?
Yeah, well, that's just a process of aging. He's talking about the ratio of the protege to the master. And David Ehrlich, who writes for IndieWire, is a very smart critic who can be nasty. He said something about first reform that I had not been aware of. He said that the scene in Taxi Driver where the young kid whose mind is infested with anger, goes to an older cabbie, Peter Boyle, outside the Belmore cafeteria and said, "What can I do? I have these thoughts running around in my head." And then the older cabbie, ignorant as he is, says, "You'll be fine." And David Ehrlich pointed out, he said, what Schrader has done as he has gotten older is flip those two. So now it's the older guy who's troubled and the younger guy who's coming to him asking for help. And it hadn't occurred to me, and it's true that sometimes, as deeply rooted as I am in self-examination and cinema and criticism, I do things that I'm not aware why I did them until some smart person tells me.
I see a hand in the back. Can you raise it way high? Yep, there's a mic coming.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay? Okay, perfect. I wanted to thank you all, for being here tonight. It was a true privilege to even just be in the same room as all three of you, truly. But for Paul, I had a question. To me, this film is about bringing order to a life of disorder. And on Wednesday, for the screening of First Reformed and the Card Counter, Paul, you spoke about how the writings of European existentialists like Dostoevsky and Albert Camus are applied to these inherently American characters. And I would just love to hear you speak more about how European existentialism inspired Master Gardener and the character of Narvel Roth.
Well, it happened because of Taxi Driver. I had the idea for Taxi Driver. And I realized that the idea was not an American idea, that it was essentially existential fiction. It was the underground man, it was Nausea, Roquentin, and it was Robert Musil, and it was Albert Camus, La Tranchée. These existential heroes who would narrate the whole story, all were men, and who had a singular and a monocular vision. It wasn't about a societal fabric like Austen or Dickens. It was about one piercing, lost person, and that was the existential cinema, literature of the 60s. So before I wrote Taxi Driver, I reread Nausea and Stranger and Underground Man, so I knew exactly who this guy was. And when the movie came out, audiences knew who he was too, but they didn't know him from American movies because he hadn't been in American movies. They knew him from existential fiction. They knew this character was out there. Now he had just suddenly shown up as a star of an American movie. And so that tradition, the 20th century existential tradition, which begins with Dostoevsky, is the tradition from which these characters spring. That's what I was trying to say.
I just wanted to say that I think this is your greatest film ever, and you're my favorite director. That's all I wanted to say.
This one here in the front. Yeah, keep your hand up.
Hi, I have a question from my mom who I took her out as a mother-daughter date to see her show. She's the one who taught me how to love films, so super happy to be here with her. And she is a Paul Schrader fan, and she would like to ask you, she's noticed from the films that she has seen, the way you portray people who have these dark histories, who have pain, who can be perceived as criminals and perhaps in society hard to love. Through your films, you display them with a lens of compassion, perhaps, a humanism. Is that your intention to have that lens of compassion? Is that a personal value of yours, perhaps? Is that something you're personally interested in, compassion for
Yeah, the question essentially is, where does this spring from? I happen to have religious training, religious education. I didn't see movies until I was in college, and the first movies I saw were the European cinema of the 60s. So, the computer gets programmed fairly early. Freud said by the time you're 5 or 6, I think probably 8 or 9. But then the software is loaded in and you just keep running it. And, that was my software. And I've been running it ever since. And it mutates, it evolves, the arc expands with age. But essentially is, that kid who was 10 or 11 years old, who was in this place, who knew he had to get out of this place. And, and that just keeps finding new forms.
I think we have time for one more over here.
Thank you all for being here today. I'm lifelong fans of all of you. My question is for you, Mr. Schrader. This trilogy is an achievement in your already prolific career. I'm just wondering if there's anything about filmmaking or yourself as a filmmaker that you might have learned from doing these movies and what that might be. Thank you.
You learn a lot. You ask me what I've learned. You learn a lot, but somehow you keep making new mistakes. You say, I'll never make that mistake again, and you don't. But you make another mistake, and you say, oh, yeah, I realize that. So it is a pattern. I'm going to do another film. I'm going to start in a month or two. Actually, I'm going to do it with Richard Gere, who was here earlier. We're going to go back after all these years. But now I'm going to do my Ivan Illich, my film about the depredations and the degradations of dying. So I guess, that's certainly not a film you make when you're in your 20s.
And on that bright note, I think we'll have to wrap it up. Thank you all so much. Thank you.